Hello and welcome back to LendAPI Academy. My name is Kay and this is episode 6 in our introduction to the LendAPI series. In this series, we're going to be teaching you how to utilize all of the features and functionalities offered in LendAPI, as well as utilizing the platform to build your very own lending product. In the last video, we went over some more fundamentals in building blocks in the LendAPI workflow. That includes our decision outcomes as well as our email templates. So with that being said, once you've set up your decision outcomes, you are now ready to start building in the Rule Studio. So let's get started. Once you navigate to the Rule Studio, you'll see that this is a very simple and easy tool to get started. All you have to do to start is to click Add New and start adding your decision trees. The best way to think about a decision tree is it is the decision logic or the engine behind how things are triggered in the LendAPI platform. When you build out a decision tree, you can utilize it to trigger an action, set off an approval flow, or even approve or deny a full underwriting application. So it's a very powerful and very unique tool to utilize here at LendAPI. And you'll see pretty soon that the decision tree is actually tied in to almost every other workflow in our workflows menu. So with that being said, let's get started. Navigating to build our first decision tree, we're going to name it after our pizza lending product. And since in our Rule Studio we've actually built out the pre-approval flow, we're going to address this decision tree to trigger the pre-approval decisions. And let's give it a description so that we understand what this decision tree is actually doing. So in this, we're going to make sure that this decision tree can approve or reject applicants based on some of the fundamentals in their pre-approval application. So once we've added our decision tree, you'll notice that you are automatically taken to the edit screen in the Rule Studio. Here's where you're actually going to be building out your decision tree. The first thing you'll see is our node map. This is actually the canvas for which you will start to connect different nodes or different rules together. Underneath it are your edit capabilities for what triggers these rules, meaning which variables you want to utilize, as well as some of the different triggers for how these variables are going to interact with each other. So with that, let's get started. So a couple things to note is for a pre-approval application in the lending world, we're really looking to knock out some very basic filters, meaning we want to make sure that we address a couple things such as age, and unemployment, and basic income. So we want to make sure we approve people, or at the very least give them a pre-approval based on some basic qualifications, if they don't meet these basic qualifications, then they should automatically be knocked out or declined. So I've listed out those three, and I think that's a perfect place for us to get started. So with that, let's start with the first one, which is always the simplest knockout criteria, which for most people is age. And that will be our first rule. And you'll see that for every decision tree, there is a start component here. This is actually just a illustration to show you how this is going to interact. The first real node is actually this component right here. And once you start to edit the actual node itself, the first thing you want to add is the title. Since we are going to be doing an age check as our first node, we're going to utilize this as whether it's a rule or an action. A rule indicates that there is a criteria that needs to be met in order for this node to progress to the next step. An action is the trigger for when something is met and what happens when this particular rule or action is taken. So that usually indicates there is an outcome, which is associated, of course, to our decision outcome. And we'll get to this in a second. But for this, because there needs to be some checks in place, this is in itself a rule. And of course, the default is the first version of this rule. And then once you've set your basic principles in place, the next step is to actually set the rule itself. And you'll see that this functionality component here is where you would set that certain rule. So when you select this first field, this is actually going to pull up your full list of variables from your variable library. This is again why it's very important to make sure you have your variable studio and your variable library set up before you start creating anything, because it is retrieved at different points of the application process. So we're doing an age check, which means that we need to pull in the variable that we're utilizing to collect the date of birth. And because, again, we are using our naming scheme for a variable studio, we named it pizza_DOB, we know that this is actually going to be pulled directly from the user input on our application itself, which we built in Product Studio. So everything, again, ties together when you have the fundamentals in place. So once we've pulled in our date of birth, we're going to need to set the rule. And this is the rule itself. So we want to make sure that the only people that are allowed to actually move forward with the application process is over the age of 18. And because we set this date of birth to be a date range, we want to make sure that if someone has a birthday that is before today, which is December 31st, we have to subtract that from 18 years ago. So let's say that today's date is December 31st, 2024. We have to make sure that the user's birthday is no later than December 31st, 2006. So let's set that as a baseline. As you can see, once I set the decision here along with my variable, the next would be the actual component that's going to trigger this decision. So we are doing the date of December 6th, 2006. If this applicant has set a date of birth after this, then they will not be able to apply. So once we have all three components in place, we can go ahead and save this rule and move on to what happens next. So you'll notice that if you set this as a rule, there's actually a component a node that comes next after this rule, which is what happens if this rule is met, which means if they are born on or before December 31st, 2006, they should technically apply. But we have a few more to check. The second check we want to do as a baseline filter for our pre-approval flow is going to be our employment status. So we want to do an employment check. And that will only happen if, again, when a age is set before December 31st, 2006. So we're going to actually create another node. And you'll see once I selected this rules with another node has appeared. So once you click this button, the next step in this filter is available. So, and you'll also see once you navigate back to age check by clicking on the component itself, that the actual yes tree, yes, or I should say yes branch has disappeared, and the no branch is appearing. So let's navigate then to the employment check. And again, we're titling this as employment check, and this will again be a rule because we need to make sure that there is a trigger in place for what happens next. And we need to set the right field this time. So for employment check, we're actually going to be utilizing the variable the employment type, which is right here under pizza employment. And if you notice earlier, our employment type is actually a list. So it's a drop-down list of selecting whether you are part-time, full-time, unemployed, or contract. And we're actually going to be utilizing the rule that if you are an unemployed applicant, you actually do not qualify for this lending product. So what we do then is we have to make sure in the decision trigger itself that if a user selects something that contains the word, selects from the list that contains the word unemployed, that this particular rule will kick them out of the process at that point. So utilizing this rule where if employment type contains unemployed, there's going to be a trigger. So what does that mean? It means that if they do contain that, then they will be declined. But if it does not contain unemployed, so if they are a contract, if they are a part-time or full-time, they should still be able to pre-qualify for at least a pre-qualified offer. So they are able to move forward to the next step, which takes us to our last rule in this decision tree, which we're going to create as a DTI check. So if you remember correctly, again, this is only for people who are not unemployed. So this is actually going to be utilizing the branch no in the child node. So if you remember, a DTI or debt to income ratio is what we have as our monthly debt over our monthly income. And we want to make sure that ratio is below a certain point, because if it is above, then they probably should not qualify for a loan due to the risk. So what we'll do here is, again, we're going to create another trigger and set a rule in place, and then let's find the variable for the DTI. Now, the DTI itself is actually not a form input variable like employment type or our date of birth. It is our derived variable because we are utilizing it as a calculation. But because we can use derived variables in our Rule Studio, this actually comes in very handy. Again, this is another powerful tool leveraged by LendAPI that allows you to mix and match different components and different types into your rules and product studio. So we have a calculated debt to income ratio variable, and we want to set this to a certain amount. Debt to income ratio is going to be a percentage, but it is a multiplicand of 100, so we have the whole number percentage, which means that we want this debt to income ratio to be probably less than or equal to 90. Again, if you are over 90, which means that you have a exorbitant amount of debt compared to your income, you probably are not a good candidate to proceed to the next step. So with that, let's save this particular rule and let's set some child branches to this rule. And I think for our pre-qualification, these filters are actually good enough to move on to the next step, which means that if you've gone through each of these nodes and you've qualified for each of these at different points, then you should be able to receive a pre-qualified offer. So for this, because it is our last rules trigger, we're going to set the next branch that comes after this to be an action. So let's do this. So now that we have a component of this being less than 90, if you do qualify, meaning your debt to income ratio is less than 90, you should be approved for pre-qual. And for this, we're actually going to set this as an action. And you'll see in a moment why this is different. So we're going to add this as a child node, and you'll see right away there's some immediate differences between a rule and an action. And once we click on the action itself, you'll see that the variable editor and the triggers themselves have disappeared. And what you have in place is, again, some of your defaults, which is your node name, the type, which is action, and of course your default version. And then below that are a few different things, which is one, the action itself, which is actually coming from our decision outcome. So this is, again, why it's so important to have that fundamental set in place before you move on to this particular step. So because in this instance, the decision outcome is actually approved because we want to pre-approve this user if they've passed all 3 checkpoints, we're going to set this outcome as approved. And then we have to select the outcome itself. Again, you'll see based on my previous video, why we set the decision outcome for our pre-approval to trigger. And this is what we will trigger once this point has been reached. So with that, now we have the action and we have the outcome to be triggered, and we can save this action within the Rule Studio. And you'll also notice that once you come to this, because it is an action, there's actually no more child nodes to create. You've reached an action point. Something will happen after this. But if you do have more complex decision trees in your application or underwriting rules, you actually can create what we call child decision trees, meaning if you've reached a certain point and this is actually going to trigger some more rules or filters to be set in place, you can actually create more decision trees and tie them into this step as a next step. So this is where you would go to choose the next decision tree. But for us, because we've reached this step, we can proceed forward for now. So we have our pre-approval screen here. Now let's go back and set what happens if you do not actually meet this criteria, meaning that your debt to income ratio is greater than 90. That actually means that we will be declining this application. And this again is going to be set as an action because we've already determined that they do not meet this basic criteria. So we're going to add this as a no in our binary child node. So again, you'll see we've created another branch in our decision tree. And this, again, being an action means that we have to select an action to go along with it. So we're going to choose the action of decline, which we've already set in our decision outcome, and we're going to choose the outcome that goes along with this decline, which we've set as pizza decline. So this means that when the decision tree has run through these rules and it comes to this, it knows that this applicant will be declined. So with that, let's save this action and let's navigate backwards. So we have our decline, we have our proof, and we have our debt to income check. And let's go back to employment because you'll see we still have a no action for employment, meaning what happens if the employer, which we have set as the employment type to contain unemployed, what happens if they have this particular variable? We're going to set this as decline because unfortunately if you do select unemployed, you will actually be declined for this particular pre-qualification. So we're going to set this as an action. So they don't even have to move to the debt to income check. We'll know right away that they'll be declined. And you'll see we've created another branch in our decision tree with decline that goes back to unemployment. And then in this decline, again, we're going to set the action at decline and then the outcome to be pizza decline. We're going to save this action. Always remember to save all of your decisions and actions as you move forward. So navigating back to our first decision tree, which we've set as the age check. Again, we're setting it so that if you are under the age of 18, meaning that If you are born after December 31st, 2006, you will also be declined. And we're setting this as, again, a child node, creating yet another branch in our rule studio. So we're going to set this again as decline, and then setting this as a outcome decline. So with that, we've actually connected all of the different logic pieces for our decision tree. And you'll see if all three of these are checked, that certain actions will be triggered at certain points. One thing to also note is, for me, I personally chose to connect all of these different uh, checkpoints or rules into one decision tree. You do not have to do that. You can absolutely utilize the child tree method, which means that you simply set an action for one rule and save that as one decision tree. And then once you navigate that, that will trigger another rule, which opens up another decision tree, and so on and so forth. Meaning that instead of one decision tree, you can actually create three and tie them at different points of your application. But for us, for simplicity's sake, I think we should just do one. And of course, LendAPI does offer you the versatility to mix and match and do what works best for you. And please note, we can change this at a later date if we run through the application and decide, no, this does not work for us. So with that, I think we're actually ready to start testing this. So once you have set all of your logic in place, the next thing to do is to test the tree itself. And you'll see here, utilizing the test button. And this actually will mimic an application in a form input field, and for you to actually test the different variables that you've set. So you'll see the first thing is they're asking you to input your date of birth. So we're going to do the, let's do November 12th, 2005. This should mean that by this logic will pass. And then next, they're asking us for our income as well as our expenses, because again, we're calculating the debt to income ratio. So let's say our monthly income is 1,000 and our monthly expenses, let's just say, is going to be 800, which takes us to be around the 80 percentile for debt to income ratio, which means again, we should pass by this standard. And then of course, employment type, which we'll set as full-time. Again, all three of these now combined should take us to an action which is approved. And you'll see down here that this output does come out to be approved. So this is correct. Now, let's just make sure some of these are working correctly. So I'm going to change full-time to unemployed. And by this logic, we should have declined this application. And yes, you'll see the action has triggered a decline action, which is correct. And let's put this back again to part-time. And now let's change this date of birth from a 2005 to a 2007 and see if that also triggers, again, a decline. So far so good. It looks like our tree is working. And once you've tested your tree to the full extent, you can actually start to utilize it. So one very cool aspect of LendAPI in our change management system is that before you can start utilizing this tree, you actually have to submit it for approval, meaning we have to publish this tree. So we've tested this tree, it's ready to be published. we're going to say test 1 success, or I should say test version 1. And I'm going to submit this tree for approval. And you'll see, again, this tree is not ready, it's not fully published yet because it is still pending approval. And how does this tie into the rest of your application? Well, let's see. To actually approve a rule in Rule Studio, you will need to go into the version control, which means that you'll view this version, and you'll see the tree description, the default, if this is the default version, and then the stat itself, and also who created this tree, and then the last modification of it. So once you navigate to this, you can actually click the approve button to make sure this tree is approved. And the reason for this is to make sure that we set the proper changes in checks and balances in place for people to approve rules and make sure that they are functioning correctly. Because again, we're utilizing a lot of sensitive data, we're utilizing people's personal data to do all of this. And the logic for being able to approve of the rule is that you have to be an admin user in LendAPI, meaning if you are a bank or a credit union and you have a set of credit control or a risk team, and their job is to go in and make decision engine changes or rules engine changes, they can actually be the ones to come in here and approve it as long as they are added into the LendAPI platform as a admin in the users setting. So because I myself am an admin, and because unfortunately I don't have a risk team right now, so I'm going to hit approve because I just tested it and everything looks good. So I will say tested 12, 31, 24, and approved. And I will set this as a default version. Again, this is another feature within the LendAPI system to put more checks and balances in place. Just because a decision tree hasn't approved does not mean it will become fully operational. It will only become operational and override the last version if you set it as a default. And we will also keep all of your previous versions of your decision tree in our version history. So at any point, if you have multiple versions of this particular rule, you will be able to fall back to a previous version if for some reason something does not happen the way you want it to. So with that, we've approved this rule and the pending badge has disappeared. This means that this rule is ready for prime time. And once we navigate back to the Rule Studio, you'll see that we've added a new decision tree into our Rule Studio with the version type as well as if it has been published, which means that it is published and ready to use, and of course the status of it. Now, if you need to edit this rule, you just simply click the edit button here. And then of course, if you need to deactivate this rule for any reason, if it is not activating properly or not triggering properly, you can always deactivate it with a one-click button. And again, this is only available to all admins of LendAPI. So if you are an analyst or another user type, you do not have the capabilities to actually action on these rules. So with that, thank you for watching our Rule Studio, and please come back and subscribe to our channel for more content on LendAPI. Thank you, and goodbye.